Thanks everyone, and thank you very much, Neal, for your invitation to present. And it was great to hear the 2015 conference that Rob Burke put on at Monash, which was the first. I was at that as well, which was a really great start, which actually began a little bit before that, back at Griffith, I think, on a similar kind of convened group of speakers on artistic research. So, and thanks very much to the other presenters. It's been an amazing day yesterday and today. What I'm going to do today is talk quite specifically, I guess, about funding, Category 2 funding. So some of you perhaps who are here that aren't in the university sector might have a bit of a gloss over moment, but then you'll pick up when I start talking about independent artists and the small to medium arts sector. But I guess the focus of my discussion is going to be on the considerations for the academy, for universities when they're working with industry. And some of this comes from, you know, I've been in academia for about 13 years now, I think, but before that I was a freelance artist for quite a long time, living from grant to grant, from being in an orchestra to being in a new music ensemble to being in a band to writing music for dance to having a free improv practice, a lot of different things. And I think there's a lot of academics like me. I'm not going to be discussing NTROs, but that will come into it, I guess, around the language. So let's just get started. Two things to clarify. One is there actually an arts industry out there? I guess it's a bit of a qualifier. When I say the industry, I'm talking about people who are engaged in work in the arts. I think a big difference that we need to bear in mind when we talk about the arts industry is that compared to other industries in which universities find themselves, the dollar values are much, much less compared to, for example, I don't know, military or Margaret was telling me about dentistry or different areas. I think that's something worth bearing in mind. And the arts industry is a sprawling organism that caters for a lot of different things. So from performance to journalism to directing, writing, all these different aspects, and I'm encompassing all of those. And this little word cloud here, money, features quite large in a strangely contradictory way. The other side of the discussion is, I guess, the new research environment in universities that's been highlighted by the era, but in particular the trial on impact engagement that's just been completed, and all universities have their reports on their desks about how they did in the impact and engagement survey or trial. But there's a few things that I think have changed as a result of that, and that the introduction of that measure that have been discussed in a lot of forums like the conversation and between academics themselves. But a couple of things, I guess, that are changing the landscape are the fact that researchers are now no longer assessed just on the quality of their research, but actually on the economic, social and environmental impacts of it. That's quite a big change from what it was before. Researchers tend to be moving from specifying aims to measuring their outcomes. So whilst the aims of research has been really the focus at before and after research project, now the discussion of outcomes are becoming an important part of the before and after, and the during actually. So we're living in a very measurement-driven climate. It's a different kind of time, a new era, I hope you like that pun, that rewards researchers for collaborating beyond their institutions. I think this is a really great thing, but it's also something that's now quite specific. And I've just added this one in, which I took away from the Deans and Directors of Creative Arts conference on Friday, which I was on a panel with Joanne Tompkins, who's the new Executive Director for Humanities and Creative Arts at the ARC, who said that a practice-led methodology should be clearly explained and applicants cannot expect the panel to understand it. So whilst on one hand we're all being expected as academics to perform within these new I guess constraints or diagrams, on the other hand we're being told we still don't understand what you're doing, spell it out. And I think there's a real friction there. There's also a friction between era and the things that are considered important in that, and impact and what they're looking for in there. So the arts are kind of stuck in between in a little way. But none of this really comes as a surprise, I don't suppose. The political climate in which we all operate now as artists and academics is a measurement-orientated one. We have to justify research funding Public funding, universities are, after all, publicly funded institutions, even though the proportion of that drops all the time and is different in different universities. I think arts organisations have been measuring their impact for some time, and they've got quite sophisticated techniques for doing that. So we've got a lot to learn from the sector. So ERA, I guess, is now all about reputation, whereas grants are actually about income. Now that journals no longer drive income to universities, they're in the ERA portfolio. That's really driving reputation and enrolments, whereas on impact, on the other hand, research income is the last aspect that will drive block grants to universities. So universities are getting pretty interested in what their possibilities are. So now we look at the arts industry and the research environment in universities. Who are these artists in the academies? So I'm kind of addressing a particular type of academic, I guess. Like I said, like in my own case, many people working in universities have come in from industry, let's bear in mind my definition of that, into academia. And I guess what's happening now is we're being asked to kind of go back into the industry again. And many of us have always kept that link. Many practising academics, let's say, continue their relationships with non-academic collaborators. But I think that this little three-way thing here is actually a great opportunity. So I'm not trying to make my presentation all about doom and gloom. It's actually about potential, but also a little bit about provocation. So the challenges, I guess, are defining what an academic artist is and what an arts industry are, and where are the commonalities and how these two things can run together and support each other. And I think that's entirely possible. So I know many of you have already seen this, many of you are very familiar with this, we saw it yesterday, but I think I've kind of put in capitals a few words that really stick out to me for artists. And this is the old Frascati manual definition that the ARC uses to, I guess, categorise what research is. This idea of knowledge of humanity, culture and society. If there's nothing that describes the arts like that, I really don't know what else. And this use of this stock of knowledge to devise applications, new ways of sharing that knowledge, I think is the key for us here. Impact, on the other hand, and this is the thing that's just been analysed in the recent trial, is this idea of a demonstrable contribution. I think that word's really important, that research makes to the economy, society, culture, national security, public policy of services, health, the environment and quality of life, beyond contributions to academia. So you see there's that frame there about demonstrating, i.e. measurable, and beyond academia, outside the academy. And I think artists who are working in universities are in a great position to contribute to that. Up to date, most of the focus on impact has been on how we're going to measure that. So there's a lot of discussions about altmetrics, about putting DOIs on creative works, things like Figshare. There are lots of ideas, but you try. Most artists who are publishing looked in somewhere like Scopus, they don't see anything there. Even though you've written 30 articles or something, one or two articles might pop up in there because of the scientific focus of that material. But things like DOIs have a significant possibility to change that, because I'm sure many of you who have made a performance that's been written about, or have written a piece that's been cited or discussed, if you can ascribe a DOI, a digital object identifier, to that, you can track it like any other citation. So creative works are being cited all the time. They're just not necessarily being counted in the way other academic publications are. Again, I see this as an opportunity, but it requires, I guess, engagement from academic staff and both the academics and the people who represent them in an operational focus. So, sorry about all these dry extracts, but these are from the Herd C guidelines, which were recently released. So Herd C is the area that looks at funding in universities. And these are the criteria that need to exist. So when I talk about engagement with industry through income, I'm looking at, I guess, things like the Australia Council, Arts New South Wales, Creative Victoria, DFAT, different residency programs, and that this money comes into the university. It doesn't necessarily stay there, but it's kind of siphoned through, not unlike an ARC grant. Some of the guidelines, for example, for an ARC grant and for an Australia Council grant are very different. So in an Australia ARC grant, staff can't pay themselves if they're on contract with the university, you can hire research assistants and so on, but it's actually a condition of funding, whereas in the Australia Council there's nothing like that in there. But I'm sure a number of you here today have sat on those panels where people have looked at applications and gone, there's two that are really close, this one's got university support, this one doesn't, we're going to go over there. Or this one's getting, money staying in the university, that one is going all to independent artists, we're going to fund that. And so they should. So I think there's something there for us to learn. But for example, at the university where I currently work at Monash, these words are very important to them. So in my applications to the Australia Council or other, I guess you call industry funders, Category 2 funding agencies, they want to see these things articulated throughout the application, but they also want to see them articulated in the budget. So what that means, perhaps, if you're commissioning a work that is then going on to be performed, let's say the research for writing a paper and the publication of the paper is the nearest equivalence to that for our boffins in the research area, in the research office, it might be that not all of it is actually a research project. So the research is the looking around for stuff, perhaps in the publication may not be considered such. So they may take some of that funding as research funding and the rest as other, which can help staff in other ways depending on the kind of performance metrics you have at your university. We'll talk about them more in a minute. But again, I've put in capitals, I think, the words that really identify the arts to me. And again, there's no shortage of them throughout. This, though, does scare me. This is the next page on the same document, which says that activities that do not meet the definition of research and development include, and look down there at number X, artistic performance or expression. So, I don't know about you, but the word artistic performance hasn't been used since about 1850, and expression, the implication that art is always an expression of something is not necessarily a contemporary view either. So it really does make me wonder about who writes these documents. In fact, if you look at my to be planned and budgeted systemic, I'm sure that's not the right word there, so I'm a bit dubious about this document all over. But this is a really big concern because we're basically acting like this isn't there. Or we address it in a strange way. And I guess it's up to us to lobby the authors of the Herdsey guidelines to ensure that this has changed because it's really out of touch with what's actually happening in universities. So bear with me for a moment. I'm trying to translate these Herdsey requirements into our everyday lives. I've been doing some experiments at Monash around rewarding staff in their workload for professional practice, which I guess validates the need, I guess, for conservatoriums and music schools to have staff that are practising, literally practising and performing outside the institution, but not necessarily trying to jam everything into this research paradigm. So there's a level of recruitment that happens through that process. So I actually, I guess in some ways I'm a believer that not all practice has to be framed as research. In fact, you're better off having certain aspects of your musical life that do fit into that and some that don't. For some, all of it can fit. I think for composers, perhaps that's a bit easier. Not necessarily, but maybe some classical performers playing, it can be challenges that they may choose to not undertake in certain forums. So I guess these questions are just ones that I find useful when I'm talking to staff about the kinds of projects they're going to do and the kind of things that they would like to have funded by a Category 2 grant. So there's a bit of a problem here around equivalency. I'm not a fan of equivalency, but sometimes when you're talking to your research officer, it's actually quite helpful. So what I mean by equivalency is how much, is it equivalent to a paper or a book? These kind of things. I think, though, this really devalues this idea that a brilliant idea, can often be rendered in a nanosecond and have a much more important, a much bigger impact on your field than something you've worked at for years. Likewise, something that happens in this room by a staff member or a student could have a bigger research impact over the next 20 years than something that happens in the Opera House. So the era is not really set up to recognise these things. It's tied up a little bit in the steam. So I think you have to work with these rules and regulations and choose your time carefully about when you decide to report, I guess. But I think one of the most key things in here is right in the middle, and that is for musicians quite often there's a confusion around extending their own knowledge and extending knowledge for the sector. And I think once you nut your way through that, you're in a good place. And the idea of innovation. So even a piece that's been played hundreds and hundreds of times before is there to be innovative. We've seen some great examples of that at the conference today and yesterday. And I guess the idea of innovation doesn't always have to be something brand new. It can be a new way of doing things if we go back to those Hertzie regulations, but also a new way of doing things that's then disseminated. And also the scholarly contribution. So one thing is having a contribution to a discipline. A scholarly contribution is slightly different, and it's worth thinking about what that means in your particular area. So going back to what I said earlier about workloads, who's recognising professional practice in the workload? I'd be really interested to know what's happening in that space. And, you know, how do schools manage with their research office about forcing all practice into research, and especially in some of the G8 universities which have a very generous research allocation that's, you know, monitored, you know, done through performance management. It's quite loose and free. And the other idea about, you know, research happening in insignificant venues and the complexities of recruitment when you're looking at engaging staff. Yes, you know, we're teaching HDRs, we want HDR qualified staff, but then there's these other frictions in a lot of schools around practitioners and their ability to recruit students versus academics and their ability to improve the research output, which is a loss-making exercise for the school. So you've got this real friction. Research is a loss-making activity because, you know, if you put your time in kind and you make a project, there's no income coming in the other side, but you're still sitting in your office using the photocopier and the power and the wonderful auditorium. These all have costs. I am constantly reminded as head of school. So what about the difference between ARC and Category 2? So there's, you know, how they define in the Hertzie guidelines these different categories. The category I'm talking about specifically is this other public sector research income, university language. But just because, you know, a lot of artists, when they come into the university, have already written easily a dozen grant applications. They've already rendered many ideas, they've researched them and realised them. They've collaborated consistently with people across disciplines, and they are very good at being efficient, so with limited funds, limited resources, making something quite significant. However, they're not always great project managers in the environment of the university where there's hundreds of people running around doing different things like finance officers and so on. But I guess the key here is, if you're applying for a grant, what is it going to pay for? And I think this is where there's a kind of a level of social responsibility that kicks in. We've got the opportunity, I think, in the current climate to leverage university infrastructure in a way that benefits the independent and small arts organisations, independent arts sector, let's say. I think we take a lot of these things for granted, those of us who have been in university for some time. University staff, I think, have almost like an obligation to work in kind on projects where independent artists are involved. And they can work with the ARC model is you do your stuff in kind, but you have assistants to help you, and you could kind of translate that across to Category 2, where we could say, you're doing the project, but you're working with other artists as in that kind of framework, let's say. There's considerable administrative support within a university, which we do take for granted, which includes, of course, access to libraries, equipment, space. So I'd like to point out too, equipment that's constantly upgraded, and it's very difficult for a lot of independent artists and small organisations to keep, with the current change of technical equipment, to keep that up to date. Students as collaborators, so numbers of students that can work with the people in the industry, and also just rethinking about this horrible casualisation of the academic workforce as something that might be an opportunity for an artist residence. So acknowledging that you have all these things and you can share them with the arts sector. So rather than getting a flute player in 2 hours a week for 12 months of the year, engage them as artists in residence and give them access to some of these things, get them to engage with your students, and give your staff a bit of a wake up to some of the problems or, I guess, issues around in independent practice. It's an opportunity too to bring in the PhDs and DCAs that we've trained back into the academy and with them their knowledge that they've acquired over the time since they've graduated. It's a way to make closer relationships with the smaller arts industry and share and trial innovations in an environment where it's not a make or break ticket sale kind of event. However, there are challenges with this. I'm not trying to put this out there as an easy story. Anyone who's had to deal with the finance department at the university knows that it's not easy. And that's why we have research assistants to kind of mask that from people on the outside. Universities, just basic things like enabling people, that you're collaborating with, access to these things outside of the time when they're full of students. That's a really important, annoying detail which people tend to forget when they start these kind of collaborations. It's worthwhile knowing that the success rate to the Australia Council currently is really similar to that of the ARC. So for artists who say, well, I'll never get an ARC, it's too hard, it's kind of similar for artists trying to get Australia Council grants, for example. Might be different in the different state funders, but definitely in the ARC, in the Australia Council forum. But also understanding and recognising the privilege of academic life. While we are often stuck teaching in confined, time parameters that independent artists don't have to have, we do have definite privileges and advantages that artists out in the industry, out in the real world don't, and it's worth just bearing them in mind when dealing with them. Things like, we have big trouble at university with our finance departments. Well, that's not their problem, it's actually our problem, and we have to deal with that. There is an issue here, though, that I think is worth remembering. So you might think, okay, there's simple things I can do. I can do a commission for free. You don't need to pay me because I've got a job already. You could say, I'll do my time. It's in kind as part of my research allotment. But every state has a competitive neutrality policy, which is basically set up to make sure that you're not undercutting others in the industry because you're offering, your big fat institution for free. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but I think it's something to bear in mind when you're thinking you're being the most generous person in the academy. You might be undercutting someone else out there who could have that opportunity and be paid for it. So I'm not providing a solution to that, I'm just putting it out there, I guess, almost as a provocation. And universities send out mixed messages. My son plays AFL, now I've moved to Melbourne, there's no way of getting out of that, and Monash sponsors his league. And I'm just like, why? What is that? But then I might be negotiating a partnership, and my school is in no position to sponsor anyone. It's more a fee-for-service kind of arrangement. So there's a lot of confusion there about this kind of pay-for-service versus strategic investment idea, and we have to be cautious. Here's just a couple of research projects, I guess, that would suit a Category 2 application in particular. You'll notice there it's mostly focused around development and research into ideas, developing new works, residencies where you're looking at something, commissioning of work, and work that has a kind of publication that comes out the other end, like an actual hard copy traditional research output, like that has an ISBN or some other tracking thing. And public benefit, I think, is the real key here for university funding, and it's something the ARC has refined. And there are definite ways, talking about academic art, that you can network with the independent artist. And when I put these there, I thought they just really mindlessly simple. But actually, I think when I look at the academics around me, they're not that common. So engaging with concerts and arts events that aren't by your staff or students, so that you're actually an active and present member of the arts community. You're part of peer review panels in state and federal government and funding agencies. You've got the opportunity to do that. You really learn a lot and you can give something back, let's say. And as I said earlier, the implications of the freelance lifestyle and how different they are, but also the ability to provide your academic skills and to collaborate very openly with them, I think, is really important. And just to be collaboration ready, I think a lot of artists working in the academy already are. And just before I conclude, I'm doing my own little experiment. I've written an opera, and during the process of workshopping that, I was very lucky to have a 2-week workshop period. I really engaged social media as much as I could as a way to track its impact. Having a blog with interviews with people, each one of those interviews is on Vimeo, it's got its own DOI. Instagram, and it's not just me, it was all the contributors are all kind of taking part of that, the audience, the choirs and so on. Twitter feeds, reviews or feature articles on the process, as well as my own personal blog, which outlines a lot of the detail in the process. So you can see, there's a little excerpt of the notation. I'm not going to play it through, but you can see how someone might go, that's kind of like research-looking music to me. So I'm easy. Got it easy in some ways, but I am very understanding of those who choose different processes. So just a couple of final thoughts while my friend Tina drums inside a dead aeroplane. I think we've got a responsibility as academics to be part of the arts community, where what we learn continues to be useful to them and relevant to everyone. Academic representatives for arts researchers need to lobby government and update ERA and HERDC guidelines. It's up to us to make change. It's been proven that it's not going to happen any other way. We need to place universities back in the heart of arts in public life. The ivory tower days are gone, and we need to be back in the real world. All the measurement is being driven by that. But it's a fantastic opportunity, as much as anything else, to work alongside other practitioners, to enrich our academic life, to enrich the arts life more broadly, but not to compete against them. Thank you.